Yeah, thank you. And I would like to firstly thank the organizers for having me at this conference today, and I hope everyone is keeping good health. So today I'm going to be talking about understanding the initial IND submission, especially the first 30 days. So I'm Gowri. I am the director for CMC and regulatory affairs for a small pharma called Iterion based in Houston, Texas. I apologize. A quick disclaimer. So the views and opinions presented here are those of the speaker and should not be considered to represent advice or guidance on behalf of the US FDA. Hope everyone is able to hear me okay and see this. You're able to see my screen okay? Okay, so today's emphasis of today's presentation is going to be the initial IND. That's the IND that gets submitted before the phase 1 clinical development can begin and before even the first human participant in the clinical study can be dosed. So you may all know that IND can be opened at a phase 2 stage or even at a phase 3 stage, but today's emphasis is going to be on the initial IND for phase 1 clinical development. So let's take a quick look at the fact sheet that we're going to be talking about in the next couple of slides. So usually the FDA starts the review once the sponsor's IND submission, that's the initial IND submission, is received. And there's only 2 outcomes of this review process. That is, FDA reviews it, sees that everything looks safe to proceed, and will issue a study may proceed letter, which is always a good news for the sponsor. On the other hand, of course, the unfortunate decision could be that the study is placed on hold for safety reasons. So we are also going to be looking at what is clinical hold, how is it imposed, and how can a sponsor respond to the clinical hold, and how can a hold be lifted. We are also going to be looking at scenarios such as inactivation and termination. So let's quickly look at the background and significance. So before any investigational drug can be tested in patients, investigational new drug application has to be submitted to the FDA, and the FDA's primary goal is to make sure that it's safe to proceed. So the primary goal of the initial IND is to present the FDA with the data showing that the study drug, the proposed study drug, is reasonably safe to use in the early clinical testing. So the FDA takes 30 days to review to make sure that the study participants at any cost will not be subjected to any unreasonable risk during the early clinical testing. That's what we're talking about phase 1. And also that the study design addresses all of the study objectives. And of course, if at all there is any slightest concern about the safety of the proposed investigational drug, the IND can be placed on hold. So we talked about the initial decision that yes, if everything looks good, the FDA will approve and the study can proceed. So if everything looks good, then the FDA issues what's called as the study may proceed letter. And once that letter is received by the sponsor is good to go and can actually begin dosing the first study participant in the particular clinical trial. And the date on the activation letter and the date on the letter, the study may proceed letter, actually indicates what's called as the activation date. And the day the study may proceed letter is issued is where the IND becomes active, and the IND is set to be active from that particular date. So the sponsor of an active IND has a lot of responsibilities and obligations in terms of notifying the agency of any particular changes to the process, any changes to the protocol in the form of amendments that will come with time, and also any changes in that case, and also the sponsor is obligated to submit periodic annual reports and other safety reporting as necessary. So we are going to real quick look at what does the initial IND content look like. And I think many of you are possibly sponsors here and might know the long journey that it takes to get to the initial IND. So getting to an initial IND is a company-wide initiative, involves several cross-functional teams from non-clinical, CMC, you have the clinical team, you can have the biostatisticians, you of course have the regulatory team, which actually the regulatory writer would possibly put all the information together into the IND format, and you might have a publisher who possibly publishes this in the ECDD format, which is the most recent or the most common format at the given time. So in a big picture, the IND content typically contains the information about the proposed drug's composition. There's a lot of quality information that goes in, and also all the manufacturing processes, the data, and of course, the key is the safety testing from the preclinical studies. At certain times, the initial IND might also have some supportive information from previous experience on the same proposed drug in humans, and that can form the rationale for its safe use in a clinical setting as well. Of course, it goes along with the IND package is always the study protocol, which is basically the detailed description of the plan for the testing and the study participants, and also how the study participants are going to be protected through the study. I'm going to real quick touch upon the pre-IND meeting, or it's also called as the Type B meeting. Though this meeting is not actually mandatory, but I would definitely recommend any sponsor, be it a small company or large company, to start engaging with the FDA as early as the pre-IND meeting. So this pre-IND meeting can have two possible objectives that a sponsor can accomplish. One is that the sponsor must be or is willing to actually present all the safety data that's been generated through time to get a kind of idea from the FDA on whether that safety data is adequate to actually begin clinical testing. That could be one objective. The other objective could be that the sponsor has several questions that he or the sponsor would like to get clarification from the FDA, and this is again the opportunity to do so. So how does this process work? So basically, the sponsor has to formally request for the meeting, and FDA usually schedules the meeting within 60 days of the request. And within 4 weeks of the meeting, there's something called briefing document. Many of you might be familiar. That is due within 4 weeks of the meeting. So the briefing document has different names. People call it briefing book, briefing package, meeting package. So basically this contains like a concise information. It has a kind of a background synopsis followed by specific questions around the background. So depending on the resources, this meeting can take different formats. It could be a face-to-face meeting. This could be a video conference. This could be a teleconference. And otherwise, it could just be a written response by the FDA. So regardless of the format of the meeting, the outcome of this meeting is not binding. It's just a mere recommendation by the FDA. So the sponsor does not have to actually implement all of those thoughts that FDA has provided in the response. However, it is always good to do so, so that the sponsor can bridge any gaps or any missing data that might potentially lead to a clinical hold upon submission of the initial IND. So this is something that I wanted to touch upon. So we looked at the initial IND, we looked at the pre-IND meeting, and assuming we have the IND package ready, we're going to look at what happens, what is the process like once the IND gets submitted, and we'll segue into the review process right after that. So the moment the IND is submitted, it arrives to the central document room, and it can be submitted in the electronic format, or if still companies are, back in time, they're still submitting old school, then with the paper format. In either case, the submission is recorded into the DART system. That's the document archiving, reporting, and regulatory tracking. And once this happens, the IND gets assigned to the division based on indication. Say, for example, the investigational drug is for anti-cancer, then this will be, the IND will be routed to the division of oncology. If it's going to be, say, for example, pediatric indication, it'll be routed to the department of or division of pediatrics. Once this happens, it just then gets forwarded to the chief of project management staff, who then assigns the regulatory project manager. And this regulatory project manager becomes the point of contact between the sponsor and the review team. So basically, this regulatory project manager becomes the liaison for the given IND. And this regulatory project manager also is responsible for issuing the acknowledgement letter. So the moment the IND is received, an acknowledgement is sent to the sponsor saying that the FDA has received the initial IND application. And the date on that acknowledgement is the date when the clock starts for the 30-day review process. And this regulatory project manager, of course, also will track and manage the entire IND review process. So the IND gets reviewed by a team of experts. They are from diverse disciplines, from CMC, toxicology, pharmacology, biostatistics, and so on and so forth. And this whole group of people, a team of experts, review the IND, and they take about 30 days to review the IND and decide on whether it's safe to proceed and everything looks good, there are no safety concerns. Then the sponsor receives the study may proceed letter, and then the IND is set to become active. On the other hand, if at all the FDA does come across any safety concerns, then the IND is going to be placed on clinical hold. So that's not something that any sponsor would want, but let's now see what happens, what can we do if there is a clinical hold. So let's quickly look at the definition of a clinical hold. So clinical hold is nothing but an order issued by the FDA to the sponsor of an IND to delay proposed clinical investigation or suspend an ongoing clinical investigation. It can take two forms. One is a full clinical hold, which, as the name suggests, is a delay or suspension of the entire clinical study under the IND. And this is what becomes applicable for the initial IND, because if at all there's any concern related to the safety of the study participants, then the entire study will be placed on hold and the sponsor cannot start dosing. On the other hand, the partial clinical hold, as the name suggests, is the delay or suspension of part of the clinical study under an IND. This kind of is more applicable for later stages of clinical development. Maybe you have an amendment, or maybe later phase 2 or phase 3. Maybe there's an example where part of the protocol changes or amendment is allowed to proceed, whereas the rest is not. So now let's look at what can be the basis of clinical hold. We have been talking about safety all this time, and safety is paramount. So anything that is going to impact safety is going to be a rationale for putting the study on hold. So the primary reason is if at all the human subjects would be exposed to any unreasonable and significant risk of illness or injury. And this could come from two different things. It could be something related to product quality issues. Maybe there is some new impurity that's seen in the drug product. It could be something to do with the stability of the drug, or it could even be other toxicological issues that impact safety. There can be other reasons as well, such as the clinical investigators not being qualified. The investigator's brochure is misleading, it has errors, it's materially incomplete. Or it could be that there is some data gaps where there's insufficient information that's presented to the FDA that they're unable to assess the risks to the subjects. In a very rare case, it can also be a case where there's exclusion by gender for, say, life-threatening diseases without proper or adequate justification. Usually, the reason or rationale for the clinical hold is very crystal clear. There's one primary reason why the study is placed on hold. However, there is a very small population or proportion of applications which are placed on hold for a combination of multiple deficiencies. Now, So what do we do when we have a potential clinical hold? So typically when there's a clinical hold, the best possible option, if it's a simple thing that's going to be something that is missing, or that's some data that can be supported or added to the initial IND. So initially the FDA will attempt to discuss and satisfactorily resolve the matter with the sponsor. That's the first thing that will usually, that's the best path forward. And most potential holds can be resolved through such discussions, whereby, as I just mentioned, there's inadequate stability data, there's missing CFA, there's something to do with the study design that doesn't sound right. Those things can be discussed via teleconference with the FDA. We'll discuss it with the sponsor, and the sponsor can incorporate those missing pieces and provide that in the response to lift the clinical hold. So who has the authority to impose the hold? So it's the division director, or the person acting on behalf of the division director makes the final decision to impose the clinical hold. So usually, as we just talked about, there's usually a teleconference that is the most common thing that takes place between the sponsor and the FDA, where the FDA will try to explain. And once that happens, the regulatory project manager also notifies the sponsor and will explain the reasons for the clinical hold. And usually within 30 days of the teleconference, the clinical hold letter is issued, which contains details of the missing pieces, the missing data, the concerns that FDA has. So now we're going to look at the options. Of course, the first thing that any sponsor would do, having spent a lot of time and money into the clinical program, is try to get the program back up and running. We'll try to respond to the clinical hold. Of course, the response to the clinical hold can be, maybe immediate because there's something that got missed out in the initial IND submission, or something that's data is awaited that was not included in the initial IND submission. Or it could be altogether something new that, that the sponsor has to generate the data for. So in either case, there are a couple of things that the sponsor needs to keep in mind, and these are some of the good practices, or rather the best practices, especially when responding to the clinical hold. The foremost thing is that the sponsor has to be very concise in the response, in the sense that provide response only to the queries or concerns raised, and not provide any information outside of the queries raised. Maybe the sponsor has generated some other extra data. No, you don't share that. You only share what is appropriate. That is the key thing when you respond to a clinical hold. And of course, though it's not mandatory, the second thing is it's always important to include a cover letter that talks about the fact that the sponsor is responding to the clinical hold, and highlight the subject, stating that this is response to the clinical hold with that so-and-so IND number. And also make sure that it gets routed to the appropriate division. And if it's in the case of paper copy, it needs to be submitted in triplicate, the first copy in original and 2 duplicate to make sure that it's received by the FDA and processed in a timely manner. So what happens next once the response has been submitted? The regulatory project manager will receive the package and will real quick touch base with the review team to get an opinion on whether, get a high level opinion on whether the response is complete or there's something more missing. So if the response is complete, then the regulatory project manager will send an acknowledgement letter. Again, the date on the acknowledgement letter is the date for the new 30-day cycle or 30-day clock. Again, if the response is incomplete, then the regulatory project manager will try to get in touch with sponsor and notify the sponsor that the responses are not complete. So if the responses are complete, and again, if the responses are adequate enough and do satisfy the concerns raised by the FDA, then the hold will be lifted. The study may proceed letter will be issued with the date on which indicates that the IND is active from that particular date, and the sponsor can actually start dosing the first human participant in the clinical study. Their other option is, this is very rare. I have never come across this option during my experience so far, but there is this option available, is the appeal process. There is an option for appeal if the sponsor disagrees with the reasons cited for the hold and can request for the reconsideration of the decision in accordance with 21 CFR 312.48. So there is this option, but yes, I believe most of the sponsors will try to respond to the clinical hold, and most of the time the concerns raised would, I believe, will be quite appropriate, and I believe, of course, there is an appeal option available too. And the third option is, for some reason, the sponsor is not able to respond to the clinical hold. Maybe it's lack of funding or other issues around it, or decides not to respond to the clinical hold. Then if the IND remains in an inactive status, or it's rather in the clinical hold for greater than 1 year, then it will be placed on an inactive status by the FDA. So once the IND becomes inactive, then the sponsor is no longer obligated to submit any of the amendments, any changes that take place to the process, protocol. Nothing has to be communicated to the agency via amendments, no need to submit the annual reports, and so on. And in case the IND remains inactive for 5 years or more, then it will be terminated. So when the IND gets terminated, and in case for some reason the sponsor decides to start the study again, then the whole process has to restart from the beginning, because once it's terminated, it has to go through the whole process again. We saw some of the best practices along the way. I'm going to talk about some more best practices here that can, possibly have a smooth sail in terms of getting the initial IND without any further roadblocks or, gaps or delays rather. So though it's not mandatory, a cover letter is extremely helpful. Please do include a cover letter along with your initial IND submission, and of course, all subsequent submissions as well. And please do include a contact phone number and also an alternative name and contact phone number in case the primary person is not reachable, and of course the email IDs. And every submission, including the initial IND, needs to be accompanied by the form FDA Form 1571. So make sure that is appropriately filled out and accompanied with the initial IND application. And in case of a paper copy, it has to be submitted in triplicate. You have the first copy will be your original, and then it'll be the other two will be the copies. And of course, it's very important to proofread your submission to make sure there are no errors, there's no missing documents, there are no missing CFAs, and of course, there's no data mismatch between what you have generated versus what has been what's going into these modules to make sure there's no data gaps or data integrity issues. Of course, always organize your IND with a proper table of contents so that it's easy for the reviewer to get through the sections in an efficient manner. And in case of a paper submission, don't divide your submission with colored paper. Always use tabs. And make sure for every initial IND submission, make sure that the study protocol or clinical trial protocol has been included. And especially for the initial IND, be sure to be available during the first 30 days in case FDA is going to get in touch with you. And of course, if there is some concerns with funding, it's better to withdraw the IND. So these were some of the best practices to keep in mind. And I would like to thank everyone for your patient listening, and I am happy to take any questions.